Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're so happy to see you to the inaugural Descendants Day of 2021. I am co-chair Detisa Brown Gathers of the Descendants of Enslaved Communities at the University of Virginia. Our board, Descendants groups, also welcome you, which are Naya Bates, Dr. Carolyn Dillard, Bertha French, James French, Halise Henderson, Nina Polly, Star Reams, and Colleen Yates. Each of us have been working hard to make even this very day happen. So again, we welcome you. This is a recorded event. If there is a disruption due to weather in some areas or storms, please know that we will reconvene in about 5 minutes. This COVID season has brought many changes to most of us, but also today it's a good thing. We can now use the question and answer area, the Q&A area, if you have questions and would like to drop them in the box throughout the procedure. Remember, at the end of this descendants, or those of you who quest to research your descendancy, there will be a separate event following. Please listen for those instructions. Following me, you will hear remarks by Kevin McDonald of UVA Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, co-chair Bertha French, and our moderator for the night, Naya Bates. Thank you all for coming, and thank you all because we actually had about 433 that have signed up tonight. Give yourselves a hand. And again, we thank you, and I pray that you enjoy the afternoon.
One second while we unmute our speaker.
Wonderful. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Kevin McDonald, and I serve as the University of Virginia's Vice President for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Community Partnerships. And I'd like to thank Bertha French and Detisa Gathers, co-chairs of the Descendants of Enslaved Communities, for their leadership and collaborative spirit, and for inviting me to provide opening remarks this evening. Now, first and foremost, I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge that the land that we live, learn, and work on is the traditional territory of the Monacan Indian Nation. We pay respect to their elders, both past and present. And additionally, we honor and pay respect to the enslaved people who built and who labored at the University of Virginia, and who are the primary reason that we are gathered here this evening. I'm so honored and humbled to be part of tonight's official launch event organized by the Descendants of Enslaved Communities at UVA. The mission of this important coalition is to research and reclaim the narrative, to honor the legacies of enslaved and free Black communities and their descendants, and to achieve restorative justice for communities rooted at the University of Virginia and surrounding regions. And this mission is one that I believe is vitally and integrally connected to the work of the Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at UVA. On this inaugural Descendants Day, we recognize those who were enslaved and forced to work at the University of Virginia, building its physical structures and maintaining its operations during its formative years. Whether their names are included on the wall of the memorial to enslaved laborers, or whether they have yet to be identified and properly recognized, we know that they are not forgotten. Their lives and legacies are remembered and honored, especially through their descendants, many of whom are present this evening. We also recognize the significance of the good work that has already been done in the form of the historical and genealogical research, of building community and connecting families, as well as the importance of the work that is still to come. We commit to ongoing collaboration in order to identify and honor the legacies of these ancestors and to implement focused efforts aimed at healing and repair. Again, I'm humbled to be here today to affirm this commitment toward a more just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bertha French, and I am co-chair of the Descendants of the Enslaved Communities at the University of Virginia. I'm also the third great-granddaughter of Priscilla Simpson of Orange County, and I am also a Black alumna of the University of Virginia, one of 5 in my family. I will be referring to our organization as the DEC throughout my presentation. And I'm very pleased to speak to you a little bit about our mission and our vision going forward. In the last year, we've managed to get a lot done. We've moved from being a planning committee for the unveiling of the memorial to the enslaved laborers to organizing ourselves as the first ever independently self-determined group of descendants of enslaved people working with one of Virginia's universities. To tell the truth and help people reckon with this history, the descendants seek to research and reclaim the narrative, to honor the legacies of the enslaved and free Black communities and their descendants, and to achieve restorative justice for communities rooted at the University of Virginia and surrounding regions. Through our membership, we strive to identify, engage, and build community, and we serve as the collective and unified voice of all descendants of enslaved and free Black communities who labored at the University of Virginia through our investments in research, education, and preservation. Our vision and our hope to accomplish these goals is by building coalitions and a strong framework for reparations. Our aspirations are, without limitations, the following: to locate and reunite descendants of enslaved and Black communities at UVA, to advocate for descendants through scholarships, tours, memorialization, and other programs and activities, to foster partnerships that benefit the descendant communities at UVA and around the world, to engage in planning and sponsoring educational, social, and economic activities and opportunities that will provide for future generations. Our organization belongs to a growing consortium of descendant communities from the Commonwealth of Virginia, dedicated to preserving the memory of the many forgotten souls who shaped not just the physical, but the political, economic, and cultural landscape of our nation, of Charlottesville, and the University of Virginia. Descendant communities are highlighting the foundational role race-based slavery, white supremacy, and colonial systems played in building many of our nation's institutions, including our current systems of finance, education, healthcare, and housing. The DEC views the University of Virginia as an African-American historic site built by the more than 4,000 enslaved laborers identified through university-led archival research and whose biographies continue to be unearthed by our organization. The university literally would not be here were it not for our ancestors. Some of the highlights from our last year have been establishing our 501c3 status, building key partnerships with the Jefferson School, UVA student leaders and organizations, and university professors across several faculties. Through our partnership with Dr. Shelley Murphy, we've identified over 100 potential descendants, and that is a growing number. And finally, engaging with the MEL naming committee to identify more names to add to the wall. What does the future hold as we build programming around our mission to reclaim, honor, and repair? First and foremost, we want to strengthen our membership platform, build a strong coalition of descendant groups and outreach programs to identify and explore questions we want to answer for ourselves as we fill out the biographies of the more than 4,000 enslaved laborers and beyond. When you consider that Georgetown University has identified over 10,000 descendants from the 272 enslaved people sold by the Jesuits, we know that the legacies of the enslaved at UVA are vast and wide. So we've got a lot of work to do. As students come and go, the descendants would like for the university to activate a central function within that would institutionalize an entity or research unit that would be a proponent to continue partnering with us in our quest to identify our ancestors. We look to a future where UVA commits to follow the examples set by places like Montpelier, Highland, Monticello, and Georgetown University, which have all committed resources to do this work in perpetuity. While we are encouraged by the symbolism of the unveiling of the Mel as a sign that UVA acknowledges how predominant the institution of slavery and the ensuing caste system were to realizing Mr. Jefferson's university experiment, we believe more intentional work with the descendant community is needed to achieve restorative justice, specifically using a model of collective research and shared stewardship of this university. Now that the governor has signed into law HB 1980, we look forward to working with the university leadership as they develop how it will comply with Virginia's new law on reparations. Our hope is that descendants and the local African-American community will play a part in shaping the outcomes. I'll now turn to Naya Bates, who will introduce our panel and proceed with the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertha, for sharing our story. So tonight's main event is a panel of celebrated scholars on descendant communities, on the history of enslaved people, and how institutions can reckon with this past. So I'll start by introducing our panelists, and then we will move forward with the conversation. Dr. Andrea Douglas holds an MA and a PhD in art history from the University of Virginia and an MBA in arts management and finance from Binghamton University in New York. Douglas has taught graduate and undergraduate classes in African American, contemporary, and art theory, and has published exhibition catalogs and scholarly articles. From 2004 to 2010, she was curator of collections and exhibitions and curator of contemporary art at the University of Virginia Art Museum. Douglas was recently appointed to the Governor's Commission to study slavery and subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination. She is also the co-chair of the President's Commission on the Age of Segregation at the University of Virginia and sits on Monticello's Advisory Committee on African American Affairs, as well as the state's history of lynching in Virginia working group. She has served on the City of Charlottesville Blue Ribbon Commission on Race, Monuments, and Public Spaces, the University of Virginia's President's Commission on Slavery at the university, and was chair of the city's Place Design Task Force. Next on our panel is Dr. Jody Allen. Dr. Jody Lynn Allen, PhD, is a native of Hampton, Virginia, and assistant professor of history at William and Mary. Her research interests cover the broad span of the African American experience in the US. Allen is also the Roberts Francis Ings Director of the Lemon Project, a Journey of Reconciliation, which is addressing the history of African Americans at William and Mary and in Greater Williamsburg. Our final panelist tonight is Michael L. Blakey. Michael L. Blakey is the National Endowment for the Humanities Professor of Anthropology, Africana Studies, and American Studies, and the founding director of the Institute for Historical Biology at the College of William and Mary. Dr. Blakey was a key advisor for the award-winning Race, Are We So Different exhibition of the American Anthropological Association, where he held several offices, including president of the Association of Black Anthropologists from 1987 until 1989, and a member of the editorial board of American Anthropologists from 2012 to 2016. Blakey represented the United States on the Council of the Fourth World Archaeological Congress in Cape Town, South Africa in 1999. He is a member of the Scholarly Advisory Committee of the National Museum of African American History and Culture of the Smithsonian Institution, where he previously held the position of Research Associate in Physical Anthropology at the National Museum from 1985 until 1994, He was Scientific Director of the New York African Burial Ground Project from 1992 until 2009, the most extensive bioarchaeological project in the United States. The Manhattan site became a US National Monument in 2007. Most recently, Blakey has been associated with the Montpelier Descendant Committee. So without further ado, I bring you our panel tonight on Descendant Communities in Virginia. Please bear with us as I make our hosts visible. If our panelists could please turn on their cameras, unmute. Thank you. So even though I've read everyone's official bios, I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to describe how they began working with descendant communities. And we'll start first with Andrea Douglas.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having me and inviting me to speak on the panel. I am so very proud to be associated with this group of historians, of those who are engaged in finding as much information about their own descendancy as they can. I am, as Naya explained, the executive director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And the Heritage Center describes itself as an art and cultural center, which means that we engage in public programs that bring to light the cultural production of African American people, both locally, nationally, and globally. One of the main things that we do here at the Heritage Center is research. One of those through our Isabella Gibbons Local History and Digital Humanities Center. The other thing that we do is we have a permanent exhibition called Pride Overcomes Prejudice. And that is through that exhibition, we tell the history of the Jefferson School, which was founded in 1869 as a freedmen's school. Its first African-American teacher was Isabella Gibbons, who many of us living in Charlottesville understand was enslaved at the university. It is her words that are on the Mell Memorial. Once she was emancipated, she left the university after 4 months. She ran a school and then came to the Jefferson School to work with Anna Gardner. And I think it was in about 1866, and she then becomes the first Black teacher. She's joined by Paul Lewis thereafter. So the work at the Heritage Center is to begin to tell that story, to tell the story of the development of this school. And from that moment of 1865 into 1965, when it stops being first, until 1951, the high school, and then 1965 stops being an elementary school and ultimately ends some level of biracial education in Charlottesville. So we're telling that story. And we began first with talking about the Jefferson School as an educational entity. And then midstream began to say to ourselves, well, if we are going to describe this post-emancipation period into this modern moment, we really ought to have to take a step back as well. And in so doing, thinking about asking ourselves the question, how do people emancipated in 1865 begin to create a whole community just 10 years after freedom? And so we really had to take that step back and begin to describe enslavement in Albemarle County, realizing that there were 52% of Albemarle County was enslaved. And if you do all the math and you started counting up all of Jefferson's enslaved people, enslaved people at the university, that did not total the 15,000 plus people that 52% represented. So our interest in descendant work began as a desire to describe enslavement in Albemarle County writ large, really at that 300,000 feet space. And then also then to tie those descendants to the history of education.
And moreover, to really start to begin to look at this not just as a local story, but really as a regional story, that the movement of people in and out of Charlottesville, what constitutes those, that ecosystem even between free people and enslaved people, and how then we so quickly can move into this sort of industrial age movement. So that's how we really began thinking about descendant work, and really trying to make the relationship with all the alumni that we were talking with all of the people who we engage with on a regular basis here, to fully understand the fact that moving from enslavement into even the urban ring, and then creating this sort of continuous almost 150-year presence, what does that look like? So we've been engaging in that kind of work, and that's how we got really deeply involved in thinking about that. And of course, being helped by Nia Bates to create that exhibition that we launched in 2019?
2019.
18? 2019 time, whatever, you know? So yeah, so that's how we began our descendant work. And we continue to do that in multiple ways. We received a National Trust Grant. And so we're working on a project that we call Saving Places. And through that Saving Places project, we are trying to tie owned property to descendants in the community, and really be able to give them the history of their property and property ownership. So that's one of the other projects that we have going that allows us to really be engaged with descendants.
Thank you. Jody, could you tell us a little bit about the work that you were doing with the Lemon Project, and how you all began engaging with the descendant community at William and Mary? You are muted.
Okay. Thank you, Nia, for inviting me. And as we became, the Lemon Project got its start in 2007 when students called on the university to study its history with slavery, make that history public, and establish a memorial to the enslaved. A faculty resolution followed in 2008, and in 2009, the Board of Visitors acknowledged William and Mary had been an enslaver, and also that it had been an adherent of Jim Crow policies. And excuse me, acknowledged that William and Mary had not been a good neighbor to the African American community in the greater Williamsburg area, and that and established the Lemon Project, a journey of reconciliation, and established initially an 8-year research project. But we figured out pretty early on that we were not going to be able to go into the archives and do the research and come out with, here it is. And that we needed to do that, but we also needed to work with the African American community. And so we did the research, but we also, again, we decided during that first year to have our first symposium. And we invited, there were members of the community to be on the panels, to talk about their experiences with William and Mary. We had William and Mary students and faculty and administrators were also on those initial panels. We also chose to have that first symposium at the Bruton Heights School, which was the K-12 segregated school for Blacks in that community. It was very central to the community, and the the alums had decided to, the school was sold to Colonial Williamsburg, and they were going to tear it down and build a parking lot. And some of the alums got together and they basically convinced Colonial Williamsburg to maintain the school. And so we had our first three symposia in that building because it was of the centrality. It was the place where there were movies on Saturday night, dances, the athletics drew the Black community. It was also the site of the USO during World War II. And so it has held a very special place within the Black community. And so we went there until we grew out of it. And then we often say, you know, we're very happy that the community followed us to campus. And so now the symposia generally take place on campus. We also, just in terms of engaging with the community, we've always considered the African American community in Williamsburg as a descendant community. We don't know yet of bloodline descendants of the people enslaved by William and Mary. We have recently been able to hire a postdoc who a major part of his work is to uncover and work with the community to find bloodline descendants of people who were enslaved by William and Mary. So it's in community engagement has been important to us. We are planning a memorial to the enslaved, and which we'll break ground for on May 26th. And from the beginning, we started that with a class in 2015. And there were we invited members of the community to take the class. There were traditional undergraduate students, a graduate student, and administrative staff from the college. And during that time, during the class and after, we held meetings in the community to ask people, you know, what do you think, you know, about this? Should William and Mary have a memorial to the enslaved? Where should it be? What should it look like? And we asked those questions. We also provided an opportunity for people to share online their thoughts about the memorial, about the Lemon Project. All of our events have always been open, and we've welcomed people from the community. And so that's, you know, I think I don't want to use up all the time, but we've seen that as our major goal is to engage the community and to find out what they're thinking and what they want from us, because too long, I think William and Mary was a part of that community, but not, I guess you would say, among the community. You know, there was we discovered that wall, there's a literal wall around the historic campus that was built in the early 30s. And the Black people in the community saw that as a way of keeping them out. And so one of the things that will be happening when we, where the memorial is going to be on the historic campus, which is where everybody felt that it should be, and that wall will be broken as a part of building that memorial. And so we're hoping that the community will see that as another sign that William and Mary welcomes them. You should not live in a college community and not feel like you have a place on that community that you should, on that campus. You should be able to take advantage of everything that the campus offers, whether it's speakers or special events or what have you. And so that's what we're striving to do, to show in particular the African American community that they are welcome and embraced by William and Mary. And so I'll stop here, and we can ask questions. Yeah, I can answer questions later.
Thank you. The community engagement piece is so essential to this work. Before we move on to the rest of the questions, we'll give Dr. Blakey an opportunity to introduce how he came to this work as well.
Thank you for having me here. We coined the term descendant community for public engagement in 1993 at New York's African Burial Ground. It was part of a plan to see to the empowerment of the African American community there over the cemetery, which was originally contained 15,000 enslaved Africans in the 17th and 18th centuries. The federal government was involved in a building project that uncovered it. And there were issues of what would be done with it. The government was not particularly interested in it. And the archaeologists who were there were not well trained for it, though they were required by law. So we brought a team from Howard University and 8 other institutions to develop the African Burial Ground Project. And from the moment we got there, having been informed largely by, I think there are 2 branches to this, indigenous peoples struggle for control of their ancestral remains that had 3 years before led to the NAGPRA legislation. And I had worked with Native American Rights Funds and others to try and build a bridge between archaeologists and indigenous people. And the African American tradition of activist scholarship. I think all these came to bear on the idea that the descendant community deserves stewardship, as they were insistent upon. And the thousands of people over time who in the early 90s were having prayer vigils and protests in the street and meeting on Capitol Hill and City Hall in New York, pressing for their control. So we were ready and organized to develop with them a clientage model. In other words, the descendant community was our ethical client. They called the shots, as any family would call the shots about what would be done with their loved ones, their cemetery, their memorialization. And so they would make the decisions about memorialization, they would make decisions about interpretation and whether there would be research or not. And in this process of what we thought of as the democratization of knowledge, they could and did pose the research questions. And these were very new, fresh questions, things that were of interest to African Americans. And I can tell you, an interdisciplinary team, just as an example of one of the results of pursuing the question of origins is direct-to-consumer ancestry services. And if you read Alondra Nelson's Social Life of DNA, she will tell you the story of how that began with our public engagement there. And there are a number of other things of that sort. So in the end, we developed because we had a set of questions that belonged to the community, and some of them were our offering, and they would have to agree, and did, for the remains to be kept out of the ground for a certain period of time at Howard and at the World Trade Center, where we had a lab. And with proper reburial, it became a national monument rather than the plaque on the wall that the GSA at first had asserted it would celebrate it. And a visitor center, a museum-like visitor center. So since then, descendant community engagement has expanded in many ways. In some ways, it's been weakened. We can talk about that later if you like. But in Rio de Janeiro, in Senegal, there are projects that have followed essentially ours. And we're working in my Institute for Historical Biology, working with Jamestown now, the Angela site, Colonial Williamsburg, the First Baptist Church site, other sites around the country, Africa Town in Mobile, Alabama, all involving descendant communities. And one we're particularly, we've worked with for a long time, I have for almost 20 years, is Montpelier's, the Montpelier Descendants Committee has developed as a result of the National Trust's expansion upon descendant empowerment to include interpretation at museums and historic sites like Montpelier, always affording them, in this case, not complete power, but equal power, for example, to the boards of those institutions as at Montpelier. And so it's very important, I would say, that descendant communities have their integrity, that they select themselves. And there's a long history of an attempt of others to select, our leaders or others' leaders. The people must select their own leadership and have the integrity of their own organization. And with that voice, they can speak for themselves. So this is what the Montpelier Descendants Committee is working with now, with some difficulty, but I believe they are, they will succeed in short order.
Thank you. I want to return to something that Dr. Allen said earlier in her response when you spoke about the importance of access. And I promise we're going to get to the audience questions in just a few minutes. So if we could keep our responses here a little bit shorter so we can get through more questions, that is what we will do. I'm realizing we completely under budgeted the time that you all could have spent sharing gems with the community. So thank you for bearing with us. So Dr. Allen, if you could just speak a little bit about the importance of accessibility in descendant community work and accessibility to data and information about enslaved communities and in making those connections with the wider communities around our institutions.
I'm going to learn this probably in 2 years after this is all over. I'll remember to unmute. Anyway, what I was saying was that it's important that the people in the community feel that they have access to these institutions. And especially when we're talking about state institutions, their tax dollars are going toward those schools, the building of them, the maintenance of them. And so they should feel that they can come on campus and use the library, go to just hang out if they want to. One of the stories that we learned in early interviews was that people felt, they couldn't even come, or during the Jim Crow period, they couldn't even just take a Sunday stroll across campus. If they were seen, they were asked to leave, and they were endangering themselves possibly, to just walk across campus. And so they should, it's important to feel that, that you have access, that if your child wants to go to college and stay at home, they should have that, they should feel comfortable that that's a place for them. One of the other stories we learned early on was that there were some guidance counselors who were saying to Black students, I don't think William and Mary is going to be a comfortable fit for you. And so again, if you live down the street from a state institution and you would like to attend that institution, you should be able to go and you should feel comfortable there. You should see it as an option. And so that's those are some of the reasons why access, I think, is so important to the community, period.
Thank you. And the access question also makes me think about the role of students in this process. So often we think that there is a town and gown divide between universities and the communities that are around them, but also between historic sites and their communities. So accessibility is a key point for our discussion of engaging descendant communities. Dr. Douglas, I wondered, in thinking through the historic relationships that these spaces have with their communities, if you could talk to or speak to how the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center has specifically grappled with responding to and healing trauma within the community.
Yeah, this is, we can really think about the kinds, first of all, I want to say that the kinds of partnerships that we have made it possible for us to be as responsive to the community as we possibly can. In relationship to UVA, for instance, I've been on both commissions, now engaged with the university on them for 8 years. And so there is a way in which the information that we are creating and developing from that space is being brought into the community so that the community better understands what that trauma in fact looks like. But I think that as a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission on Monuments and Spaces, Public Spaces, is really how the Heritage Center became a kind of focal point for dealing with community trauma. Certainly it's important to deal with the histories, but it's also important to be the space where you can uncover those histories as well. And so engaging with the process of finding the exact location, for instance, where the 1898 lynching occurred, and then creating the process for people to engage with that in a 5-day, I call it a forced march, but others call it a pilgrimage to Montgomery, where we were able to look at what happened in Charlottesville in 2017 over the larger history of racial violence against African-American people. We then brought that experience back to Charlottesville and engaged in another year of public conversation about what the community's racial politics look like. Because of the Blue Ribbon Commission's recommendation to have statues removed, we were also then forced to engage in another kind of education, which meant we had to really start to talk to people about what those statues actually meant, outside of being Confederate monuments, actually being monuments to Jim Crow and the Jim Crow period. So we spent another good year of really standing in front of those monuments, describing them, but describing them in relationship to African-American oppression, the idea of disbursement and land loss, very important in terms of thinking about what a community gains, but also how much a community loses as a consequence of living in Charlottesville during this period. And then finally being able to put a marker in front of the courthouse that then describes John Henry James's lynching as an extralegal activity, and therefore defining African-American trauma in relationship to the judicial system as well. So I think over the course of the last 4 years, being really able to place in context the continuum of African-American presence in the community, despite the really difficult and highly racialized spaces, and really also bringing to light the notion of racism and white supremacy in this community as a sort of historic fact. And so we've been doing that over time. And I think from my experience on the first day of the commission in 2013, and then being involved with the Blue Ribbon Commission, and now the commission in the University in the Age of Segregation, being able to meld all of these histories, I think Charlottesville as a informed space has come a very long way, fairly quickly, I would argue, over the course of the last 8 years, given the broad spectrum of the histories that we describe. I think that what we've been able to do, we've experienced street name changes, we've experienced buildings at the university being changed, we've experienced monuments being placed such that we can really see tangible evidence of change and in the community. We still got a long way to go. We took down a Johnny Reb statue, but hopefully we'll be taking down additional statues and then moving towards writing a more authentic description of our public spaces here. So, and happily, the Heritage Center has been able to take leadership in that and find opportunities in that way.
Thank you. And so before we open the floor to the questions that are in the chat, I have one final question for Dr. Blakey. And that is, in recognizing that there's so much trauma and there are a lot of different people coming into the descendant work, what is your advice to people who are embarking upon this journey?
Well, I really want to, if I could take that question to those structural issues that are fundamental. You know, we've come too far to settle for less than true equity. That's how I see this. I think the National Trust rubric calls for structural parity, full partnership. That means equal empowerment. That means ownership, as in New York. They had ownership of our project. And so African Americans became very interested in their domestic archaeology for the first time because it was their project. And I think that's what the rubric calls for throughout. So if we look at something like, I don't know if it's being able to walk around in William and Mary that's paid for by our tax dollars, or to use Montpelier or Monticello that was built by our ancestors, people know that. And one cannot, they know when the wool is being pulled over their eyes, that one would allow them to do this versus that they actually have ownership, that they actually have at least equal say in what's interpreted there, what's important there. Then their children will go there. Then they will want to stroll there because it will belong to them. And so the thing I would advise is, again, that descendant communities organize in a way that truly empowers them, that they have their own autonomous, self-selected organizations, and that they work according to the rubric to demand of these institutions their involvement in the decision-making, in the receipts, in the interpretation, in all aspects of those institutions, that this is a door of descendants to, really being, someone once said that what did the enslaved hope for that would allow them to survive? They hoped for us. And as descendants, we should not let them down. Did they hope for us to settle for less?
Amen. Amen. I just want to thank all of our panelists for a wonderful discussion tonight. This has been inspiring. It has been thought-provoking, and it has been thoroughly educational, and we've only spent the past 30 minutes engaging in this conversation. So I really do want to thank you all for bringing this level of attention to detail and energy to this conversation. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and unfortunately, we are short on time. So what I'm going to say to our attendees tonight is we're going to save the chat, and we will respond to all of your questions, but it may happen via email as opposed to our discussion. So in these last 5 minutes, I'm going to bundle some of our questions together, if that's all right with our panelists. And please, anyone who feels called, please respond as succinctly as possible so we can try to squeeze in a few extra questions. Philip Cobbs in the audience asks whether reparations efforts centered around institutions like UVA and William and Mary, institutions that are focused around the history of white men, is a continuation of a structure put in place by slavery, and does it stratify the descendant community? And how would you overcome that through engagement?
I would just say, if Black men and women are involved in the design of the interpretation of the history of William and Mary and its continued development, then that may be the only way to prevail over that history.
Thank you. The next question that we have comes regarding the size of the enslaved community at William and Mary. Do we know how many people were enslaved there, Dr. Allen?
We have identified 190 people. Some of them I refer to them as sightings in the record because their names are often not there, but there's a mention of an enslaved woodcutter or an enslaved glazier, or just sometimes it's just that there's a mention in it of a person, of an enslaved person. So we have found 190 and we're still looking.
May I also add that the scope is actually much broader, because all of the students who could pay, who were landowners, were paying, the school was paid for initially in tobacco, which is another word for enslaved labor. All of tuitions were paid for by enslaved labor. There was even the Nottoway plantation was a college-owned plantation for middling planters who couldn't afford to pay tuition. It was an affirmative action for poorer whites, and their tuitions were paid for in the enslaved labor on the Nottoway plantation. Every brick was made probably by, I don't know, Jody, how much you've looked at this, but industrial slaves. People were being rented out, I'm sure, all over Williamsburg, all over that area to build the university. Everything, every tuition until the end of slavery was paid for by African and African-American labor, which goes beyond the 200, I think. But that's it's important to think about the scope that you're looking at. How many they own regularly, that's one thing. That's not what built the institution, it was everything. And everything was slavery.
Thank you. And on that note, we'll conclude our Q&A. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And I am going to pass our program off to Miss Colleen Yates.
The Descendants of Enslaved Communities at the University of Virginia wishes to thank our ancestors and our supporters. If you'll bear with me, we've got sort of a long list of supporters, but I'd like to thank them all. Andrea Douglas, Executive Director of the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, Central Virginia History Researchers, Deanna E. Evans of WilmerHale, Executive Mansion Descendant Committee, Highland Descendant Committee, the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center, Jody Allen, the Lemon Project at the College of William and Mary, Kurt Von Dock, Logan Botts of UVA Reflections, Louis Nelson, Maupin Town Media, Memorial to the Enslaved Laborers Community Engagement Committee, Michael Blakey, Institute of Historic Biology at the College of William and Mary, Monticello Descendant Community and Getting Word Oral History Project, Montpelier Descendant Community, Myra Anderson, Ronald C. Merchant of WilmerHale, Shelley Murphy, the Equity Center, the Office of Executive Vice President and Provost, the Office of the President of the University of Virginia, University Communications, UVA Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Z Society. I'd like to also add, I see people have asked a lot of questions and we may not get to them. You may also email us at info@descendantsuva.org. Once again, you may email us at info@descendantsuva.org, or you can visit our website and we hope that'll answer a lot of your questions. That is www.descendantsuva.org. Once again, that's our website address, www.descendantsuva.org. As we close out this portion of our programming, we wish to sincerely thank each of you for your interest and time this evening. This Zoom will now close, and we ask that only descendants and those researching their heritage stay on the Zoom to move to our descendant-only discussion. Thank you all.